I've always believed that hard work speaks for itself. That if you kept your head down, delivered results, and proved your value through the work, the recognition would follow naturally. I held on to that belief for years, even when the evidence started stacking up against it. Even when I noticed the pattern. Even when I told myself I was imagining things. It took one boardroom meeting, one smug smile, and one very well-prepared folder on my laptop to finally prove myself right. Just not in the way ID originally hoped. My name is Dana Kelly, and am a project manager at a mid-sized marketing firm in Austin, Texas. The company is called Hartwell Creative, and on the surface, it's a great place to work. Exposed brick walls, open floor plans, a rooftop terrace where people eat lunch on nice days. The kind of office that shows up in lifestyle ads about millennial workplace culture. The kind of place that puts people first on its website homepage and then grinds those same people into dust behind closed doors. I'd been with Hartwell for 4 years when all of this happened. 4 years of solid performance reviews, 4 years of being the person teammates came to when a deadline was on fire, and 4 years of watching my ideas walk into meetings in someone else's mouth. But in getting ahead of myself, my direct boss was a man named Greg Sutton. Greg was the kind of manager who had mastered the art of appearing competent through proximity to people who actually were. He dressed well. He spoke confidently. He used the right buzzwords in the right rooms and had a handshake that made clients feel like they were dealing with someone important. Greg was good at Greg. What he was not good at was the actual work of marketing strategy. I figured this out within my first 6 months at Hartwell. Not because Greg ever admitted it, he most certainly did not, but because every time a project hit a wall, it was someone on the team who climbed over it while Greg sent encouraging emails from a safe distance. He had a particular habit of disappearing during the messy middle of any campaign, then reappearing just before the presentation with a lot of enthusiasm and a suspiciously thorough understanding of work he hadn't done. For the first couple of years, I told myself it was fine. He was a manager. Managers delegate. That's the whole point. I was still getting good reviews. I was still getting small raises. The work was interesting enough that I could swallow the frustration and keep going. I made excuses for him the way you make excuses for a leaky faucet. You know it needs fixing, but as long as it's just a drip, you live with it. The drip became a flood in January of last year when Hartwell landed the biggest account in its 15-year history. The client was a national fitness brand called Corpulse. They were expanding from an app-based platform into brick-and-mortar studios across 12 cities, and they needed a comprehensive brand awareness campaign to support the rollout. The budget was significant, the kind of number that makes an entire room go quiet when someone says it out loud. The CEO of Hartwell, a sharp woman named Miriam Cole, had personally flown to Chicago to close the deal, and when she came back, she gathered the whole company in the conference room and told us that this was a defining moment for the agency. She wasn't wrong. It was also, as it turned out, a defining moment for me, just not in any way I planned for going in. Greg called me into his office the morning after Miriam's announcement. He sat back in his chair with his hands folded behind his head and told me he was putting me in charge of the Corpulse campaign. He said he had full confidence in my abilities. He said he knew I was ready for something like this. He said all the right things, and I was genuinely excited, genuinely grateful, and genuinely foolish enough not to read the room correctly. Looking back, the signs were there. He asked me to copy him on every single email. He requested weekly strategy documents that he could review and provide input on. He scheduled himself into every client-facing call, though he rarely spoke during them. He wanted to be looped in on every decision, every creative pivot, every data point. At the time, I told myself he was being a supportive manager. I told myself he was invested because the stakes were high. What he was actually doing was building himself a paper trail he could walk across when the time came. I spent the next 3 months living and breathing Corpulse. I assembled a small team of 3 people, a content strategist named Becca Torres, a data analyst named Kyle Ward, and a graphic designer named Simone James. The 4 of us worked late nights, reworked strategies when early data came back soft, argued productively about creative direction, and slowly built something we were all genuinely proud of. The campaign was called Show Up, a nod to both the physical act of walking into a fitness studio and the deeper psychological idea of committing to yourself. The concept was mine. I sketched it out on a legal pad at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in February, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and too many browser tabs open. It came from something personal. I'd been going to gym on and off for years, always showing up for a few weeks and then letting it slide, and what finally made me stick with it was a coach who told me that the hardest part is never the workout itself. It's walking through the door. That idea became the spine of everything we built. I documented everything. This was partly habit, in the kind of person who keeps receipts in a dedicated folder in my email, who takes meeting notes even when no one asks me to, who screenshots approvals because once, early in my career, someone told me I'd submitted something late when I knew for a fact I hadn't. But it was also, if I'm honest, because some part of me had learned to be careful around Greg. Some part of me that I hadn't fully listened to was already keeping score. I have time-stamped emails. I have design brief documents with my name in the author field and creation dates in the file metadata. I have Slack messages and shared Google Docs with version histories that tell a complete, chronological story of who thought what and when. I have calendar invites showing who attended which calls. I even have a voice memo I recorded for myself after a late-night strategy session in March, just narrating where we were in the process and what I was planning to do next, a habit I'd developed as a way of processing my thoughts. None of it was gathered with the intention of being used as evidence. It was just how I worked. Greg's involvement in the actual campaign was minimal. He attended the check-in calls. He nodded at the weekly documents I sent him. Occasionally, he forwarded an email to me with a note that said something like, "Thoughts?" And I would respond with a detailed analysis, and he would reply with, "Great, thanks." He approved the creative direction in week 4 with the words, "Looks solid to me," in a one-line email. He was present the way furniture is present, occupying space without contributing to the function of the room. By early April, we were in the final stretch. The presentation to Corpulse's leadership team was scheduled for the last week of the month, and Miriam Cole would be in the room. This was the kind of account where the CEO wanted to be seen showing up, which I completely understood. I prepared a full deck, 62 slides, structured in 5 phases, with a narrative arc that walked the audience from market insight through creative strategy through projected outcomes. I rehearsed it. I had Becca and Kyle run mock questions at me so I'd be ready for anything the clients threw out. 2 days before the presentation, Greg called me into his office again. He told me there'd been a change of plan. He said Miriam felt it would be more cohesive if the presentation was delivered by senior leadership, meaning him, rather than by the project team. He said it wasn't a reflection of my work, that I'd done a phenomenal job, and that I would absolutely be in the room and could jump in if there were technical questions. I remember sitting across from him and keeping my face completely neutral. I remember nodding slowly. I remember saying very calmly, "I understand." And then I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and spent the next 2 hours making sure every single piece of documentation I had was backed up, organized, and accessible. The presentation was on a Thursday morning. The Corpulse team came in, 5 people including their CMO, a polished woman named Renee Park, who had a reputation for asking sharp questions and not letting vague answers slide. Miriam sat at the head of the table. Greg stood at the front of the room next to the projection screen. Becca, Kyle, Simone, and I sat along one side of the table. And then Greg presented our campaign as though he had built it himself. He didn't say the team developed. He didn't say Dana led this. He used the word "I" more times in that first 10 minutes than I had heard him use it in 3 months of actual project work. My insight was that the consumer motivation gap was being overlooked. I developed the show-up concept around the idea of the studio threshold as a psychological turning point. I structured the campaign in 5 phases because I wanted the rollout to mirror the client's expansion timeline. My concept, my structure, my words, practically verbatim, from the brief I had written. I looked at Becca. She looked at me. Neither of us moved. Kyle was staring at the table. Simone had her hands folded very carefully in her lap. Renee Park from Corpulse asked where the show-up concept had originated. What was the creative genesis? Greg said it came from his own experience with fitness, his personal relationship with the psychological barrier of commitment. He smiled. He was so smooth about it that I almost wondered, for one disorienting second, whether I had imagined the last 3 months. Then Miriam Cole looked down the table and said, almost as an aside, "Greg, remind me, who is the project lead on this?" There was a brief pause. The kind of pause that sounds like nothing to most people in a room, but sounds very loud if you're one of the people it concerns. Greg said, "I oversaw the full campaign with team support." Miriam looked at me. I don't know if it was instinct or strategy or 3 months of quietly simmering frustration finally boiling over, but I heard myself say, clearly and without hesitation, I led the project, along with Becca, Kyle, and Simone. The room shifted. Not dramatically, no one gasped, no one stood up. But it shifted. Greg gave a short laugh and said, Dana was absolutely central. I meant the whole team collectively. He said it with the ease of someone who'd smoothed over awkward moments many times before. But Miriam Cole was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and Renee Park from Corpulse had written something in her notebook. The rest of the presentation proceeded without incident. The clients loved the campaign. There were handshakes and smiles and talk of next steps. Afterward, in the hallway, Greg clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Great job," as though nothing had happened. I went back to my desk and I sent Miriam Cole a meeting request for the following morning. The subject line was, Corpulse Campaign, Project Documentation Review. She accepted within the hour. I spent that evening pulling everything together into a clean, organized folder. Not frantically, I was calm, almost methodical about it. I put together a timeline of the project from the initial brief through the final deck. I included the original concept document, timestamped, with my name in the author metadata. I included the email chain where ID pitched the show-up concept to the team in early February. I included Slack threads. I included the version history from the shared Google Doc showing every contribution and when it was made. I included Greg's "looks solid to me" email from week 4 and the absence of his name from any substantive creative document in the entire 3-month period. I also included a short summary document, 2 pages, that simply laid out, in plain chronological language, what happened and when, without editorializing or asking for anything specific. I had learned from watching other people navigate workplace disputes that the moment you show up with a list of demands, you get categorized as difficult. I didn't want to be categorized as anything. I wanted to be understood as the person who built that campaign. The next morning, I sat down with Miriam Cole in her corner office. She had a green tea and a legal pad, and she looked at me with the focused attention of someone who had built a company from the ground up and did not get to that position by missing things. I told her I wanted to walk her through the project documentation for Corpulse. I told her I wanted to do this because I respected her and because I respected the company and because I believed that accurate attribution mattered, not just for me personally, but for the health of the teams that do the work here. I opened my laptop and I walked her through everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry, though I'll be honest with you, there was a moment somewhere in the middle where I had to breathe carefully to make sure I didn't. I just showed her the record. Miriam asked me 3 questions during the presentation. One was about a specific decision we'd made in Phase 3 of the campaign. One was about how the team had handled a point in Week 6 when the preliminary data had come back weaker than projected. The third was whether I had shared any of this with HR. I told her I had come to her first. She nodded slowly and closed her legal pad. She thanked me for coming to her directly. She said she was going to need some time to look into things on her end. She told me the quality of the Corpulse work was exceptional and that Renee Park had, in fact, already sent her an email that morning praising the strategic clarity of the campaign. I thanked her and walked out of her office. The next 2 weeks were strange. Greg was his normal self, or performed being his normal self very convincingly. Nothing felt different on the surface. Becca asked me once, quietly, over coffee, whether I'd done anything after the presentation. I told her I'd had a conversation with Miriam. Becca nodded and didn't ask anything else, but she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and that meant more to me than I can really explain. 3 weeks after my meeting with Miriam, Greg was moved into a newly created strategic advisor role, which, at Hartwell, turned out to be industry shorthand for being removed from day-to-day management without the company having to have the Messier conversation. He no longer had direct reports. He no longer attended client presentations. He kept his office for another month and then quietly transitioned out of the company entirely, which I only found out through the general all-staff email that announced his departure and wished him well in his next chapter. Miriam Cole called me into her office the same day that email went out. She offered me a promotion, senior project manager, with a team of my own and a salary adjustment that made me exhale very slowly for a moment because the number was real and not something ID imagined. She told me she wanted to be direct with me. She said what ID brought to her in that meeting had been handled with professionalism and integrity, and that those qualities, combined with the obvious quality of the corporal's work, had made the decision straightforward. She also said, almost as a footnote, that Renee Park from Corpulse had specifically requested that I be the main point of contact going forward on all future work. Apparently, during the presentation, something about the way ID calmly stated my role had registered with her. Renee told Miriam she wanted to work with the people who actually did the work. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Here's the thing I keep coming back to now that the dust has settled and am sitting in an office that has my name on a placard outside the door. I didn't set out to take Greg down. I didn't come into any of this with a plan. What I had was documentation, and I had it because it was just how I operated. The receipts weren't a trap. They were just the truth organized. I think about the version of me that might have sat in that boardroom and swallowed it. The version that pulled Becca aside afterward and said, "Can you believe him?" and then went home and stress-ate pasta and woke up the next morning and went right back to work. I've been that version before, more times than I'd like to admit, in jobs before this one. The version that decides the fight isn't worth it, that the risk is too high, that probably nothing would change anyway. But something about watching Greg say, I developed the show-up concept, the concept I had named after my own experience of almost not walking through a gym door. Something about that particular theft made the quiet, careful part of me finally decide enough. Becca got a promotion too, a month after mine. Kyle was moved on to one of the agency's other flagship accounts. Simone's design work from the campaign ended up being submitted for an industry award. Corpulse became the anchor client that Hartwell built the next year's growth strategy around. All of that happened because of the work we did for people in a room, a legal pad, a cold cup of coffee, and an idea about walking through the door. I send Renee Park a monthly update now, directly. She responds quickly, asks good questions, and occasionally says, "That's exactly the kind of thinking I expected from you." I keep every single one of those emails in a dedicated folder. Old habits.